Greetings, fellow historians, and welcome to another review session. This time we're doing period 4, part 2, basically from the corrupt bargain of 1824 up through the Mexican-American War. Lots to get through, so without further ado, let's begin where we did last time with the John Gass painting from 1872, showing the progress from the east heading to the formidable west, the dark and ominous west, where uncertainty, Colombia, while taking progress with her, is facing an uncertain future. And that's certainly the case at the end of the Mexican-American War, in which the United States begins its territorial compromises and conflicts over the issue of slavery. We talked about potential modified DBQ topics in our last session with period 4, particularly with the War of 1812 and the era of good feelings. We could see a potential discussion about how the country was able to unify under an umbrella of political unity, economic unity, and social unity. But we could see a bit of divisiveness between the Whigs and now the new Democrats under the age of Jackson, but historians will say that Jackson expanded democracy or addressed the issues of the common man. It's a big part of our discussion today, but certainly a potential DBQ topic. Or the extent to territorial expansion, how the country moved west, and what were the compromises that came about from that territorial expansion, both from the Louisiana Purchase to the Missouri Compromise and the Talmadge Amendment. Or economic expansion. What did life look like in America with an emerging market revolution with Samuel Slater and the Lowell factory system, right? The Erie Canal and the turnpikes and roads, or the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Lastly, we could look at the debate of slavery, of course, and how that's going to be slowly evolving into a more heated debate as the Mexican-American War ends, in which the United States determines that really the slavery issue is not going to be over North versus South, but what is going to occur in the West. Bleeding Kansas and others are going to surface in period 5. The 4 major themes that we are working with for period 4 overall is going to be politics under Jefferson, politics under Jackson, economics under Jefferson and Henry Clay, economics under Andrew Jackson, Bank War, and the Tariff of Abominations. Territory and compromise, like the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson and the Missouri Compromise. Later on, the Oregon, Texas annexation under Polk, and the Mexican Cession, the War of Mexico and the United States. And finally, society and reform. What's going to happen to America's heart? We're going to transcend the mind and awaken the soul through the Second Great Awakening and the Age of Transcendentalism. There is the 6, what I call the Virginia-Massachusetts dynasty of George Washington, going on with the Virginians of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. We have the Adams family. See what I did there? With John Adams being the first president from Massachusetts as our second president, and then the 6th president being his son, John Quincy Adams. So how do we break up this dynasty, this rich Virginia planter or this merchant class of Massachusetts, a very educated, Harvard-educated merchant class of Massachusetts? Well, Andrew Jackson, a war hero from the War of 1812, on the minds and hearts of the people that live in Inner Appalachia, rather popular in local legislatures and local governments, is going to ascend to the presidency from the state of Tennessee. And one specific, really, component that allows him to ascend to the presidency is expanding suffrage. Up to this point, you needed to be white, you needed to be male, and you had to own land. Well, as the country continued to expand and land ownership was no longer a qualification, well, suffrage really increased significantly, allowing a larger voice in the greater American discourse, particularly with voting. And so it was white males, and that was it. Okay. So while suffrage did expand, it didn't expand all that much until we, of course, get to the 15th Amendment for African Americans and the 19th Amendment for women. But to get to this stage, we have a bumpy ride, and we begin with what's called the corrupt bargain, the election of 1824. The Whig at the time, Whigs are just basically Federalists that are now calling themselves Whigs because they didn't like the tyrannical nature of Andrew Jackson, and they didn't like tyrannical natures of monarchs anyways, like the Whigs in Great Britain didn't. So this new political party of Whigs under John Quincy Adams is going to be matched up against the Democrats and Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson in 1824 won the popular vote, and he won the Electoral College. but he didn't win the Electoral College so much that he had a majority, which was required to get there. Now, let's back up for just a second. For all intents and purposes, Jackson should have won the presidency, but we've seen throughout American history that you can win the popular vote and not win the presidency. And so to solve this, the election has to go to the House of Representatives. Now, to understand the concept of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, we have to look at a pattern in American history. And typically, the Secretary of State is the heir apparent to the presidency. I mean, the timeline alone will show you that President Washington's Secretary of State was Jefferson, and then he becomes president. President Jefferson's Secretary of State was James Madison, and then he becomes president. His Secretary of State was James Monroe, and he becomes president. And President Monroe's Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams. And of course, he'll later become president, but he had made the promise to appoint Henry Clay as the Secretary of State. Now, Henry Clay at this time is Speaker of the House. The election of 1824 goes to the House of Representatives. And as the Speaker of the House, John Quincy Adams pulls Henry Clay aside and says, hey, if you push the House into my favor and get the votes to put the election in my favor, I will appoint you as Secretary of State. Naturally, Henry Clay agrees because look at the pattern here, right? Once Henry Clay serves as Secretary of State under an Adams administration, well, it just seems natural, at least in the context of the time, that he would become the next president of the United States. And this kind of backroom dealing, of course, gets Andrew Jackson to rise up and call it a corrupt bargain, leads a nasty campaign. And if you think politics is dirty today, go back and take a look at some of the political ads and the opinion pieces that were written in newspapers between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. At one time, John Quincy Adams accused Andrew Jackson of being a serial killer. And with, of course, all the duels that Andrew Jackson was involved in, there might be a few coffins filled at the end of Andrew Jackson's pistol. But you think politics is nasty today, go back and look at the politics of 1824. So Jackson reemerges in 1828 after a strong campaign, garnering the vote of the American people. And of course, we now begin the politics in the age of Jackson, because the Federalists, now the Whigs, are going to be neutered by the power of the Jacksonian democracy and aren't going to really have a strong case under Henry Clay. So we're going to transition from a more participatory democracy, overthrowing the Virginia and Massachusetts dynasties. We're going to remove that quality of ownership as a that ownership quality as a qualification for voting. I said that weird. You get what I'm saying. And this is going to become much more entrenched. The country is going to deepen now from just ankle deep and knee deep to waist deep in political partisanship, and people becoming more entrenched in that partisanship and voting with party over policy. Certainly that doesn't happen today. And then the Democrats are going to be under the political leadership and the spiritual leadership, for lack of better terms, under Andrew Jackson, while the Whigs are going to remain under the political leadership of Henry Clay. The debates issue still today that we see the role and power of the federal government, particularly the executive branch and the expansion of Andrew Jackson, King Andrew the First, they're going to call him. We're going to have an issue with the Bank Recharter, not just the second recharter under Henry Clay, but that third Bank Recharter. Congress brings it forward in 1832 for an 1836 recharter, and Andrew Jackson says no, because he thinks that not only is the national bank controlling the government, he believes in state banks being more powerful in addressing the needs of the agrarian society, but he also thought the bank was a slush fund to upset his re-election campaign efforts. And then we, of course, got tariffs. That's still going to be debated through the tariff of abominations that we're going to see. That's going to greatly impact the economy, so much so that it puts us on top of closing down the national bank into a panic of 1837. And internal improvements are going to keep including the railroads and expansion of the telegram and roads and bridges and that kind of stuff. So politics in the age of Jackson are nasty. He's going to be the king of the vetoes, just 12 vetoes in his first 4 years of his presidency, getting really the Whig-controlled Congress to censure him, which means to basically shut him up. And that's not going to work. He's going to continue to bypass Congress on many of those initiatives through executive orders and vetoes. He doesn't have a veto-proof majority in the Congress, so anything that he does veto is going to stick. So they're going to lampoon him, and you've seen this document many times of King Andrew the First. Had I been consulted of the veto memory, King Andrew the First, born to command, stepping all over the Constitution with the veto papers in his hand. He's going to implement the spoil system, and I don't know if he necessarily implemented the spoil system. I'd say that really patronage is going to be a big part of the American landscape from George Washington to the present, right? But if you curry favor with Andrew Jackson, or if you donate money to him or scratch his back, he's going to scratch yours, and he's going to appoint you to a position in his administration that's going to really get not individuals that are qualified for the job, but individuals that have done good by the Democratic Party and are going to curry that favor and get a position in government. That's going to carry all the way through until really we get to on the heels of period 7 and the progressive age, in which the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act asks people to take a test and base their employment in the U.S. government on merit, not just on their patronage to a particular party or to a particular person. And Andrew Jackson's kitchen cabinet is really addressing more so his common nature, right? He would often be seen in a robe, barefoot, or in slippers in the White House. He would have his advisors sitting around a table in the kitchen. H.W. Brands, Dr. Brands from the University of Texas, has a fantastic biography on Andrew Jackson, in which he talks about how Jackson would meet people at the front door with a coffee cup in hand to talk politics with individuals that wanted to petition Andrew Jackson. So I imagine you look at the fortress that the White House is today, with snipers on the roof and gates and barriers, where there was a time in American history in which you could literally go up to the front of the White House, knock on the door, and the president himself would stand there in a bathrobe, slippers, and a coffee cup and say, "Come on in, sit down." But his advisors, they kind of took this mantra that they would sit around in a kitchen area around the cabinets. And so the birth of the kitchen cabinet came out of the Jacksonian age. So the economics under Andrew Jackson, and I'm going to go back through these a little bit more specifically. There's that Tariff of Abominations in 1828, requiring Andrew Jackson to implement the Force Act, which is going to go down there with armed troops and get John C. Calhoun to pay for this tariff that South Carolina refuses to pay for. Almost a mini civil war, if you will. Finally, South Carolina buckles, but they'll come back in 1860 with the final death knell to the at least the Union for 5 years. Vetoing of the Third Bank Charter, which is going to proclamate the Panic of 1837. And finally, this issue of specie circular, government payments in gold and silver. And I'll talk about why Andrew Jackson wanted to have currency in only gold and silver and not paper currency, making the economy even worse, and why he went that route when he's supposed to be protecting the common man. And I'll talk about that in a future slide here in just a few minutes. But before we get there, we need to understand the tariff and the nullification crisis, this idea of that compact theory. We saw it earlier under Thomas Jefferson with the Kentucky and Virginia resolves in period 3, this idea that the states can decide when they do and don't want to follow the Constitution. But what's going to end up happening is an all war is going to break out over a revenue and protective tariff. Below 25% on average is a revenue generating tariff. But once you get above 25%, you're going to find yourself really locking up any kind of exporting or importing to the country. In 1828, the protective tariff was almost at 50%. Now, to understand this for just a second, I'm going to slow this down to really explain this to you. If you have a protective tariff in place, the North is going to benefit by that protective tariff, meaning manufacturing is going to increase in the North, and they have the means by which they can keep costs down because they're producing the products. So let's take shoes. The North manufactures shoes. People in the North can buy those shoes because that's a marketplace within the North. So their prices aren't going to rise. But in the South, they have a choice between shoes from France or shoes from the North. If they buy shoes from the North, they're going to improve the Northern economy. If they buy shoes from France, they're going to pay more for those shoes. So the problem lies in when you place a tariff on the North, you're not really doing as much damage to the Northern manufacturers as you are on the South. And there's one more component to this tariff. Well, the South at this time is beginning to develop their cash crop of cotton, and they can't export it to Europe because they are also going to be met with a protective tariff on the European coast or in the Caribbean or in Latin America. So not only are you increasing costs for Southerners to buy products, but you're preventing Southerners from exporting materials to other parts of the world. So you could see why South Carolina was really frustrated by this issue. And what they ended up doing is refusing to pay this tariff and causing, in essence, the first line in the sand with being able to nullify, to null and void any constitutional acts, at least what Congress and the Supreme Court deem as a constitutional act, but the states don't. So if you get it, tariffs, and we're going to see this time and time again with the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act during the Great Depression under Herbert Hoover, right? It did some to alleviate the ills of the North, but it really made the Great Depression worse because the cost of everything rose up, and manufacturing, while still trying to generate goods, couldn't export anything to other countries. So it's going to make that economic condition significantly worse. And then Jackson, and again, I don't know the heart of Jackson. He might have been working for the good of the country. Jackson is going to initiate a bank war. Now, just to back up for a second, the first bus under Hamilton from 1791 to 1811, there's your 20-year charter, was for all intents and purposes very successful. Under Henry Clay, right? This McCulloch versus Maryland decision, right, from a Supreme Court, from a supremacy of the federal government, really established that national banks work. They're good. So this National Bank in Philadelphia was solidified for a second charter from 1816 to 1836. Now, a few years before the third charter comes up, in 1832, the third charter comes before Congress. Congress did pass a third charter, so we basically are going to have a national bank from 1836 to 1856. That's remarkable when you look at the first bank in 1791, but guess who vetoed it? Andrew Jackson. He vetoed it for two reasons. He does not like the power of the federal government controlling the purse. And number two, he started to get crazy with the idea that this was just a big fund for the government to overthrow him as president in the next election. And so you see here that Congress is going to censure him over this issue. There is Henry Clay leaning over Andrew Jackson and sewing his mouth shut. So he is going to be limited in his power and scope. But it worked. The veto stuck. It was not a veto-proof majority in Congress. And so the Third National Bank ended up failing. And so we see that Third National Bank failing in 1832, and Jackson is going to set up these pet banks in 1833, these individual state banks, the State Bank of Kentucky, State Bank of North Carolina, State Bank of South Carolina. And if you really look at it from theory, it sounds pretty good. Like, local banks can address the issues of the local farmer. Local farmers can go to their local bank and borrow. But here's the problem: is each one of these banks produce their own currency. There was, on average, right, of now various means, 22 different forms of currency that were circulating throughout the country, greatly devaluing that currency and making the economy much more worse. So number one, it's going to flood the market with currency, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of inflation, right? It's going to really take away the power of that currency. And where else have we seen currency being debated in American history? Post-Civil War, after the greenbacks were issued, because we didn't really use war bonds for revenue during the Civil War. We could talk about, to add complexity to your writing, at the same time paper currency was being debated with the gold and silver standard during the Gilded Age. The populists saying, hey, let's not just trade in gold, but let's add silver to the mix. And that's going to, of course, make the power structures on the East Coast very angry, because they want to control the currency. They don't want farmers to have access to additional currency like silver. So you see currency is being debated time and time again. And then there's that overextension of credit. Those pet banks were overextending credit to farmers, overloaning money. And those farmers, right, they have a surplus of goods they've been producing. Their wages are going to go down. Prices are going to go up. So people in the North aren't going to buy the Southerners' crops. And this is just going to make the economy worse. And so when it comes time to pay back those loans, well, guess what? The farmers can't. And that overextension of credit's really going to damage those state banks and really make them ineffective. Where else have we seen an overextension of credit? Well, add some complexity to the Roaring '20s on the tail end of that as being one of the issues that really got us into the Great Depression. That speculation, that buying of stocks on margin, and overextension of consumer credit's really going to make the economy bad. And finally, so to solve this, Andrew Jackson comes up with an idea. He says, all right, so instead of trading in currency, since there's so much paper currency floating around out there, we're going to prevent people from trading in paper currency, and you can only trade in gold and silver. hard, actual specie currency, actual money, right? And so Andrew Jackson is going to make things worse because who has access to the gold and silver? The manufacturers in the East, the individuals that do have the money, and so the farmers are going to be left out. So was Andrew Jackson a president of the common man through the tariff of abominations in the bank war? Well, that's something for perhaps your writing to decide. So we're now in the panic of 1837. We see ourselves closing the national bank. The paper currency is going to be reduced significantly, getting the state banks to produce their own currencies. And of course, prices are going to rise significantly, wages are going to drop, and then the whole trail of causes and effects occur, getting us almost to certainly a recession, but almost a depression there in 1837. Of course, Andrew Jackson leaves the presidency because his 2 terms are up, leaving Martin Van Buren with the task of trying to solve this. And of course, that's a tremendous failure of Martin Van Buren. It stains his legacy and his presidency. And so that, in essence, pulls the Democrats out of power and brings the Whigs back into power for the subsequent years. All right, so territory and compromise. We've got the annexation of Texas, the big issue because Texas is geographically below and above the Missouri Compromise line. So the issue of slavery is going to be brought into the conversation. Should Texas come into the Union as a slave state or a free state? At the same time, Polk is going to be looking at the annexation of the Oregon Territory, saying, okay, Texas can come in as a slave state, but the annexation of Oregon is going to be a free state. At the time, Oregon's territory was controlled by the British, and they had a stake in there. And so instead of going to war with the British under the slogan of 54-40 or fight, under a very aggressive territorial expansion Polk, they're going to have a negotiation in which they're going to draw a line, and the northern part of that's going to go to the British, later on the Dominion of Canada, in some of the most beautiful and exquisite geography in our world, Banff and Vancouver. And then the states of Washington, Idaho, and Oregon are going to become part of now the new Oregon Territory. So that's going to be free. And then conquest is going to occur not only with the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson, but certainly under the Mexican-American War with Zachary Taylor fighting the Mexicans down along the Rio Grande, pushing all the way into the halls of Montezuma, Jefferson under the shores of Tripoli, and then the Mexican-American War. We did pay for the land at the tail end of that. What helps us sleep at night. But the Mexican-American War is I'm going to make the case, generate more controversy in the country and being one of the earliest long-term causes of the American Civil War. All right, so there's your territorial map. Take a look there. There's your Mexican cession. Gadsden Purchase is going to come in on the tail end of period 4, early period 5. But there's your 54-40 line right there, coming up with the divisiveness of Oregon going to the British and to the United States. There's your Mexican cession territory. And of course, look at Texas annexation. Can you imagine? Texas went up to Wyoming at one time. Just monumental. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, society and reform, this is where we conclude our discussion for period 4. We're going to have a second Great Awakening under Charles Finney. Much like the first Great Awakening, the country is looking for solace. They're looking for guidance. They're looking for spiritual awakening. So they're going to have tent revivals in which they revive their spirit, baptisms in the river. If you ever want to see kind of a great depiction of what the second Great Awakening looks like, look for the Coen brothers. Gosh, allergies. Look for the Coen brothers, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, with George Clooney, a fantastic movie that really depicts that second Great Awakening. Social awareness is going to prompt us to reform. So we got religion, we've got reform with abolitionism, the temperance movement. Women now are starting to push back against alcohol on the domestic front because they're seeing the negative effects of alcohol, which we'll see again in period 6 and period 7. Cult of domesticity, and particularly with the Lowell Mill. Dorothea Dix and mental illness is going to address those issues along with prisons. Are prisons really areas that are going to reform individuals, or are they just simply institutions that are going to incarcerate, making that situation more challenging for rehabilitation purposes? Women's suffrage is going to come to the forefront, particularly at the Seneca Falls Convention in 48 in upstate New York, saying that all men and women are created equal. And some early environmental protection efforts. We're not really quite yet to John Muir and the Sierra Club, but we're going to start to see preservation efforts through the United States, and really evidenced by not only the writings of Transcendentalism and Thoreau and Emerson, right, giving us a kind of a spiritual awakening with how beautiful the landscape is and how beautiful the waterways are, but that's going to be also typified by that neoclassical art. George Bingham and the Hudson School, instead of painting portraits of important figures, they're simply going to paint pictures of landscapes. So Thoreau and Emerson are writing about landscapes and writing about civil disobedience, if you will, pushing back against some of the many injustices of society. And then the neoclassical art there in the Hudson School really showcasing the beauty that is America and why we should be preserving it. And lastly, we have these utopian societies, right? The Oneidas and others are going to be living in the rural parts of the country, either in communes or in communal living, in various different lifestyles that are going to I call it metacognition, thinking about one's thinking, looking at our purpose in society. So there's this kind of connection I like to make, and even though we're not studying period 8, between the transcendentalists and the hippies of the 1960s. What a time to be alive. So there it is, your society in reform, the greatly expanding American experiment, really seeing a variation of society, both from a religious standpoint and from a societal standpoint. So really densely packed period 4, a lot to cover, but hopefully this was a valuable use of your time and you have a better understanding of kind of the setup now as we get ready to embark upon period 5, which is going to be the Civil War. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to join me. It's always a pleasure to talk history with you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment sections below. Message me on Reminder or hit us up in the FAQ section of the forum. In the meantime, thank you for being with us. Be well, be wise, and I look forward to seeing you in future review sessions.